Government borrowing hit a record £55 billion.
Ballooning public debt.
Around $300 billion or 16% of GDP.
The COVID-19 pandemic has forced governments around the world to borrow and spend at an almost unprecedented rate. Between April and June, America alone has borrowed $3 trillion, the largest amount borrowed in a single quarter since records began.
The rise in public debt has been unlike anything we've seen in recent history.
In the past, economists have warned against high levels of borrowing. But new thinking suggests much higher levels of debt might now be sustainable. How much of a cause for concern should the world's rising public debt be?
So this video is on macroeconomics, and it's on the topic of fiscal policy, and it's going to be looking at not only national debt but budget deficits, and it's going to be looking at how governments can handle budget deficits and the fiscal discipline and the fiscal rules that some governments and political unions have. So to begin with, these are some of the countries, according to the World Population Review, with the highest levels of debt to GDP ratio in 2021. So some of these countries you might already know about. So for example, Japan and the lost decade, Greece and the forced austerity by the European Union. There have been massive news stories in the last 10, 20 years. And when we're looking at their national debt, we can see, for example, Japan, over $9 trillion. Greece, because of that forced austerity, they have managed to reduce it, but it's still standing at $379 billion. Portugal, who actually abandoned their austerity in a very significant election at the time, which went for an anti-austerity government, and their national debt is $264 billion. Italy is going to be a major focus of this video, and again you'll see why in a second, because their debt is almost $2.5 trillion. We've got Bhutan at $2.33 billion, and finally we've got Cyprus at $21.64 billion. Now again, I'm not saying that these countries have the highest levels of national debt, but debt to GDP ratio they do. So for example, Japan, 234.18% of its GDP, which is clearly incredibly significant. And we're going to look at the consequences of such national debt and such debt to GDP ratio in this video. So what happened? Well, it started towards the end of the 80s with regards to the bubble that burst and the stock market crashing. And because of that, it meant that the Japanese government had to intervene, and they had to carry out lots of government expenditure in terms of bailouts. And because of that, it caused a very significant deficit. And obviously, the greater the deficit, the more times you are operating with a deficit, that will accumulate into national debt. So Japan has run budget deficits since the bursting of this financial bubble in 1989 and 1990. So the budget deficit grew to a high of 8% of GDP in 2009 and then declined to 2.8% of GDP in 2019. Now, obviously, with regards to the pandemic, that's got new constraints on this budget deficit and this national debt. But with regards to government debt, we can see from the 1980s how it dramatically increased up to, obviously, 2021. And in fact, Japan's debt was 15 times higher than the tax revenue collected by the government in the end of 2016. So there is a worry, and the worry is that if interest rates do rise, and they rise at a faster rate, for example, than maybe GDP, then the impact of that and the impact of those repayments is going to be incredibly difficult for Japan. So if a stock market and a bubble bursting and the stock market crashing was the cause of this national debt and these budget deficits for Japan, then obviously we've seen other economic shocks in the past 10 years, 15 years, which have also led to high levels of deficit spending by governments and high levels of national debt. So let's have a look at a few now.
Now it's official, we are in a recession.
Major financial institutions have teetered on the edge of collapse, and some have failed.
In the rich world, the financial crisis pushed public debt from 74% to around 105% in the decade following the financial crisis. And in emerging economies, it rose from roughly 35% to 48% of GDP. This ballooning debt caused political panic, with some governments pursuing strict austerity to try to bring their budget deficits down during the decade that followed.
So in 2008, clearly the financial crisis, which was one of the worst in 80 years, significantly hit Europe. Many European countries had huge government debts. And some of the countries that were shown earlier were one of the worst affected. So for example, Greece. Greece had spiralling spending deficits. It borrowed much more money than it was able to make in revenue through taxes. And in 2010, the country revealed its sky-high deficit and was frozen out of the bond market. So therefore, Greece had to ask for a financial rescue by the EU and the International Monetary Fund. So bailouts, emergency loans were aimed to try and obviously help with those debt repayments and with that national debt. So Greece received 3 successive packages, totaling 289 billion euros. But because of that, it meant that they had very, very severe austerity measures placed on them. And I'll look at that in a second. The next one is Portugal. Now, Portugal, again, like other European countries, it wasn't forced upon them, but they chose to do it. Some of it because of the fiscal rules that have been set by the EU, which I'll show you in a minute. But Portugal carried out austerity, but it was proven to be so unpopular that in the election, it was pretty much a choice between pro-austerity or anti-austerity, and anti-austerity won. And then finally, we've got Italy. Now again, Italy, similar to Greece, had spiraling deficits, and they have been in talks with the EU throughout that time about the problems of their national debt and what Italy have to do to try to obviously reduce it. Now, Italy haven't experienced the bailouts and the forced austerity like Greece has, but EU is putting a lot of pressure on Italy to obviously avoid similar circumstances and try to get their fiscal discipline in order.
In exchange for rescue packages that eventually mounted to 240 billion euros, about 200 billion pounds, Mr. Papakonstantinou and his successors have had to increase taxes, make savage cuts in government spending, and put many of Greece's national assets up for sale.
We will follow this road because this is the only road to be able to save the country.
I don't see the crisis coming to an end. We are stressed and angry because we don't have jobs. I'm embarrassed that I cannot buy my little grandchildren a present.
The middle of the crisis, when I came back for holidays, you could see in people's faces that they were kind of like sad, angry, but now I think it's getting a lot better.
You need to save yourself. You need to pick up your pieces, gather yourself, see what you're able to do, see what your skills are.
actually seeing, like picking up their pieces and starting to, like rebuild their lives.
After 4 grueling years of protests and strikes, Portugal gets to voice its discontent over austerity. The choices being offered at the polls aren't new. They're familiar faces with an emboldened rhetoric. On the political right, Pedro Passos Coelho. Elected in 2011, the current Prime Minister and leader of the right-wing coalition has pushed through steep tax hikes and imposed harsh public sector cuts. Still, he's not mincing words, promising more of the same.
Our strategy is the same because the strategy is correct. We came to this election with a past, as I've been saying, but above all, a past that gave us today a present with more confidence for all Portuguese.
Challenging him, António Costa, a socialist who has been campaigning on a platform of less austerity, more investment, social justice and equality.
We must establish a new fundamental priority for our economic policy. That priority is to bring employment policies to the top of our priorities. A dignified job, quality jobs, jobs with a future must be the principal goal of a new economic policy in Portugal.
So the rules the EU has in terms of fiscal discipline relates to the excessive deficit procedure, and it's their protocol. And there's 2 main points that I want to delve into. The first one is the budget deficit. It must not exceed 3% of GDP. And the second point is public debt must not exceed 60% of GDP. If a country is consistently experiencing higher budget deficits than 3% of GDP and higher public debts of, again, exceeding 60% of GDP, then the EU is obviously going to begin talks with that country to see about in terms of what the country must do to make sure they're abiding by the rules of the Union with regards to this EDP, the excessive deficit procedure. Now, one country that has experienced such talks is Italy, who again, since the financial crisis, they've repeatedly exceeded both of these targets.
The enforcer of EU regulations, the European Commission, says Italy's government isn't playing by the rules and there's a price to pay.
With what the Italian government has put on the table, we see a risk of the country sleepwalking into instability. I hope this risk is to be avoided because at the end, what is at stake is the well-being and future prosperity of Italian people.
The dispute is over what the country owes and how it plans to pay it back, a concern shared by many Italians.
We are very worried because there is a problem. The public debt is increasing. Who's going to pay this at the end of the day?
Italy's public debt stands at a whopping $2.6 trillion, the second highest in the EU behind Greece. It's much more than what the whole economy produces in an entire year. But government revenues are also high, more than 40% of GDP, and tax rates are comparable to the likes of Sweden, Belgium and Denmark, countries that spend much more on their citizens. Those who depend on state handouts like the elderly say their livelihoods are in the crosshairs.
So as you can see, Italy failed to meet these targets of the EDP. And in 2019, they compromised with the European Commission to try and avoid that fine, and that was to reduce the deficit target to 2.04% of GDP. Now, it's also worth pointing out, it's not just Italy and Greece that fail to meet these targets. There's other countries, very influential countries, such as Germany and France, that have also failed to meet these targets. And in fact, France, they've really struggled to balance their budget in about 45 years, repeatedly missing the deficit target. And therefore, in the Financial Times, there was an article about the IMF criticising these rules, saying that actually, are they pointless if they're never really enforced? And there has been some argument that actually maybe these rules, these debt-to-deficit rules, are a little bit outdated now. And what's interesting is during the pandemic, we've not really heard much about the EU debt and deficit rules. And that's maybe because actually it might be in a couple of years' time, once the economies are starting to stabilise again, or actually maybe this forced austerity or this trying to influence austerity is again just it's not popular, it's outdated, and we're starting to see alternatives.
Austerity led to new thinking. In 2019, former IMF chief economist Olivier Blanchard gave a game-changing speech. He argued governments could borrow far more than previously believed.
I think the fact that there's been such a dramatic change in the consensus makes some people nervous, but at the same time, it wasn't a rash decision they made. It was heavily influenced by what was going on in the world around them.
Blanchard observed interest rates on government bonds have been falling, making it cheap for some governments to borrow money. At the same time, the economy was growing. Take America. The rate of nominal GDP growth, which is GDP before it's been adjusted for inflation, has generally been higher than interest rates for the past 30 years. This matters because as long as GDP is growing faster than the country's debt is accumulating interest, and governments keep additional borrowing in check, then a nation can effectively grow its way out of debt at no fiscal cost.
Mathematically, it's a very straightforward point. But when you're explaining this to governments and saying, this is how it goes, that ends up being quite a powerful thing.
Not even a year after Blanchard gave his speech, coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, and the greatest exercise in public borrowing for generations began.
That it's not going to reverse itself at some point in the future, which would be a big deal. You know, if interest rates suddenly soared, then all the countries that had accumulated a lot of debt would suddenly be in very big trouble.
Despite these risks, the pandemic has left many countries with no option but to keep borrowing. To cut deficit spending now, while the global economy is still crippled by the pandemic, would inflict lasting damage. But how much and how long countries can continue to borrow is unclear. And the colossal debt built up in the past 6 months will be one of the greatest legacies of the pandemic. But not every country can borrow its way through the pandemic.
Almost every government has found it easier to borrow now than it was 30 or 40 years ago. But the difference between a rich country and a poorer country, which doesn't have a long record of borrowing on foreign markets, those places can't get the same interest rates. It's a source of significant inequality in terms of how countries face this pandemic, that some places can borrow almost as much as they want to support their economies and others can't.